I want you to picture a sound in your mind. Just, close your eyes for a second, wherever you're listening to this, and try to imagine the heavy, relentless grind of massive oak ships being hauled up onto a cold shingle beach.
Oh, yeah. That's a very specific kind of dread.
Right. And beneath that sound, there's this low, rumbling murmur of thousands of hardened men, their voices just carrying over the water. And above it all, cutting through the damp air, is the solitary, harsh call of a raven.
It's a profoundly unsettling image to start with, but I mean, if we really want to understand the sheer panic of the year 865 AD, it is exactly the right one.
Yeah.
Because what we are looking at there is the coast of England and the arrival of a nightmare that the locals didn't even have a word for yet.
And to really grasp the terror of this moment, you kind of have to put yourself in the shoes of an Anglo-Saxon living on that coast. I mean, for 70 years, literally 3 generations, ever since that infamous attack on the Lindisfarne Monastery back in 793, the English had lived with a grim reality. They knew what a Viking raid was.
They did. And, these raids were horrifying, to be sure, but they were a known quantity.
Right.
They were a seasonal terror. You knew that when the ice melted in the fjords of Scandinavia, the long ships might appear.
So it's essentially like a hit-and-run operation. The sails appear on the horizon, you grab whatever you can carry, you run to the hills, and you hide.
Exactly.
The raiders land, they smash up a monastery, steal the silver chalices, take some captives, and then, and I think this is the crucial part, they leave.
Yes. They always left.
Right. It's like enduring a terrible hurricane. It wreaks absolute havoc, but eventually, the sky's clear and you come back down to rebuild your attached roof.
Yeah.
You can endure a storm.
Yeah.
But the fleet that landed on the shores in 865 wasn't just another storm, was it?
Far from it. If previous raids were isolated storms, this was a permanent climate shift.
Wow.
I mean, this wasn't just a few opportunistic ship captains looking for summer plunder. This was a massive, coordinated, multinational coalition army of Scandinavian warriors.
The coalition army.
Right. And the Anglo-Saxon chronicles gave it a name that perfectly encapsulates their sheer dread. They called it the Heathen here, the Great Heathen Army. And they hadn't come to grab silver and sail home. They'd come to conquer.
Which is wild, because to shift from raiding a monastery to conquering an entire country requires a completely different mindset.
Absolutely.
You don't just accidentally overthrow kingdoms. You need logistics, you need alliances, and most importantly, you need a mastermind capable of executing that kind of vision.
Which brings us to the core of our deep dive today.
The mastermind.
Exactly. The man who orchestrated this terrifying war machine was, according to the legends anyway, someone who couldn't even walk.
Yeah, we are talking about one of the sons of the legendary Ragnar Lothbrok, a figure who casts a massive, bloody shadow over medieval history, Ivar the Boneless.
The Boneless. I mean, it has to be the most intriguing, bizarre nickname in history. So for this deep dive, our mission is to unpack the mystery, the myth, and the terrifying reality of this man.
It's a huge mission. It is. We are going to explore how someone forced to rely entirely on his intellect managed to dismantle a country, kingdom by kingdom. We're looking at the ultimate victory of mind over muscle in a culture that, frankly, literally worshipped muscle.
And by doing so, Ivar forces us to completely reevaluate our assumptions about the Viking Age.
How so?
Well, we are conditioned to picture giant muscle-bound berserkers swinging axes in a chaotic frenzy. But the man who orchestrated the greatest Norse conquest in history, one with strategic patience, psychological warfare, and an intellect that stayed 10 steps ahead of his enemies.
So if we're talking about a mastermind who couldn't walk, I just have to start with the most obvious question, the one everyone asks the second they hear that name. What does Inbindlossi the Boneless actually mean? Was he literally missing bones?
That is the great historical puzzle we have to untangle first. There are several competing theories, and we really need to examine them because each one paints a completely different portrait of the man.
Okay, let's hear them.
Let's start with the most literal interpretation, which comes directly from the medieval saga material. The sagas explicitly state that Ivar had a severe physical disability.
When you say literal, do you mean they actually thought he was made of gristle or something?
Pretty much. The legendary material describes his legs as being weak, containing cartilage where bones should be, or just being entirely unusable. The visual imagery they leave us is striking.
I bet.
The sources describe him being carried into battle on a shield, or a specialized litter, borne aloft by his warriors. From that elevated position, he obviously couldn't stand shoulder to shoulder in a shield wall, but he could direct the flow of combat.
Wow.
Yeah, they say his upper body was incredibly powerful, allowing him to draw a heavy warbow with deadly accuracy, while his mind commanded the chessboard of the battlefield.
That's just a wild image. A man crowd surfing into a medieval battle, shooting arrows and barking orders.
Hmm,
But surely modern doctors and historians have looked at this, 1,200-year-old description and tried to figure out if there's a real medical condition that matches it.
they certainly have. And the most prominent medical speculation points to a genetic disorder called osteogenesis imperfecta.
Osteogenesis imperfecta.
Yes, which is more commonly known as brittle bone disease.
Okay, stop there. How exactly does brittle bone disease work mechanically? Because if his bones are just breaking all the time, how is he surviving a Viking camp?
It's a fascinating question of biology meeting history. So, osteogenesis imperfecta is caused by a genetic defect that affects the body's production of collagen.
Which is what? The stuff that makes bones strong.
Exactly. It's the protein that gives bones their strength and structure. Without enough of it, or with poor quality collagen, the bones become extremely fragile. They can break under minimal stress, even just from the weight of standing up.
Oh, man.
In severe types of the disease, a person might be completely unable to walk, and over time, their legs can appear severely bowed or misshapen.
And to a ninth century observer who doesn't know what collagen is, legs that are bowed, weak, and unable to support weight might easily be described as looking boneless.
Exactly.
Yeah.
But here is the crucial element that makes this diagnosis so compelling for Ivar.
What's that?
Osteogenesis imperfecta does not affect cognitive function whatsoever.
Oh.
People with this condition have entirely normal, often exceptional, intelligence. Furthermore, while the lower body might be severely compromised, the upper body strength can sometimes be developed to a functional degree, depending on the severity of the specific mutation.
So it fits the legendary profile perfectly.
Yeah.
A brilliant mind, strong arms capable of pulling a bowstring, but legs that simply cannot bear weight. But, and I have to push back here a little bit.
Go for it.
We're talking about Norse culture in the 9th century. This was a brutal survival of the fittest society. The winters were freezing, agriculture was marginal, and physical capability was prized above almost everything else. I've read that in some early Norse communities, there was a custom of exposing infants to the elements if they were born with severe deformities, simply because the village couldn't afford the resources to keep them alive. How does a disabled boy survive that culture, let alone become the supreme commander of a continent-spanning army?
That is the exact paradox that historians grapple with. It defies all conventional logic of the era. If we accept the physical disability theory, we have to look for explanations for his survival. And the most likely answer lies in his pedigree.
His family.
Right. He wasn't just any child. He was the son of Ragnar Lothbuck, a legendary king and warlord of immense wealth. In a hierarchical society, absolute power provides a shield. If the king decides his disabled son will live and be cared for, the community obeys.
Money and power buy survival. That makes sense. But protection only gets you so far. It keeps you breathing. But it doesn't make thousands of hardened, bloodthirsty mercenaries respect you.
No, it doesn't.
Right. If a guy who can't hold a sword tells a veteran raider to charge a heavily fortified English shield wall, why doesn't that raider just laugh in his face?
Because of the sheer terrifying force of his personality. And this brings us to the psychological profile of Ivar. Protection can keep a child alive, but constant, undeniable success is the only thing that commands respect from Viking warriors.
Imagine the psychological pressure cooker of his childhood. I mean, if you were listening to this, try to put yourself in his position for a second.
Yeah, it's intense.
You are a young boy in a high-status Viking household. You can't run in the fields. You can't wrestle. You can't train with an axe like your older brothers. In a society that values martial prowess above all else, you are pitied. You are underestimated. You know people are mocking you the second you were carried out of the room.
Constantly.
The rage that was built up inside you, the constant burning, obsessive need to prove every single person in that settlement catastrophically wrong.
It is a profound psychological crucible. The experience of being written off forged a determination that was harder than iron. If he couldn't fight with an axe, he had to make his mind the sharpest weapon in the world.
Wow.
He turned the very thing that should have marginalized him into the ultimate source of his power. He min-maxed his intellect, essentially. He became a tactical genius who fought with logistics, complex alliances, and geopolitical strategy rather than brute force.
And people follow winners.
Exactly. When your plans consistently result in overwhelming victory and massive wealth for your followers, warriors stop caring about whether you can walk.
That is such an incredible narrative, but I know historians love to ruin a good story.
We do try.
You mentioned there were alternative theories about the nickname.
Yeah.
If it wasn't a physical disability, what else could Inbanlazi mean?
Well, history is rarely tidy, and we have to be honest about the muddy waters of etymology. Some scholars suggest the nickname was entirely metaphorical. In this reading, boneless meant something akin to extraordinary physical flexibility, or more likely, a snake-like cunning.
Oh, like calling a mob boss Teflon. Because criminal charges never stick to him. It doesn't mean his skin is actually made of nonstick pan coating.
A perfect analogy. It was a testament to his ability to slither out of tactical traps, to twist political situations to his advantage, to be an elusive, fluid tactician on the battlefield who refused to fight on his enemy's terms.
Okay, so it could mean he was a slippery tactician. What else?
Another theory takes a much cruder, more biological angle.
Oh, boy.
Yeah. Some interpret boneless as a dark, physical joke about impotence. There are later sources that suggest Ivar never fathered any children, which was highly unusual for a man of his immense stature, wealth, and access to concubines.
All right.
So the nickname could have originated as a vicious playground taunt or a locker room joke about his inability to perform, which somehow made it into the historical record and stuck.
A 9th century insult that gets immortalized for all of recorded history. That is rough.
It is. And finally, there's the linguistic theory. We've seen this happen frequently with the translation of Norse names over centuries. It's entirely possible that Inbeinlasi is a later legendary mistranslation or a corruption of an older forgotten nickname.
Like a typo.
Sort of. For example, some historians suggest it might be a corruption of a word meaning legless in the sense of a sailor who was always at sea, or perhaps a reference to a specific type of wind or sail. The saga writers, centuries later, saw the word, didn't know the original 9th century context, and literally invented the whole he had cartilage instead of bone story to explain a word they no longer understood.
Wow, so it could be brittle bone disease, could be a metaphor for tactical genius, it could be a joke about his sex life, or it could be a medieval typo. That is a massive spread of possibilities.
It is the absolute definition of historical uncertainty. We simply do not know for sure. However, the dominant interpretation, and frankly the most evocative one that has captured the imagination for centuries, remains the physical disability.
Oh, totally. And oh, if you've seen the TV show Vikings, you know exactly which theory they went with. Here's where it gets really interesting if you watch the show. They lean incredibly hard into the osteogenesis imperfecta theory.
They really do.
The actor portrays Ivar as being born with legs that are severely twisted and useless. You see him as a child, literally dragging himself through the dirt while the other children play.
The visual medium allows them to explore the daily visceral reality of that disability.
It does, and they capture exactly that psychological paradox we were just talking about. They show his lifetime of chronic physical pain, the deep-seated rage, the humiliation of being the crippled son of the great Ragnar.
Right.
And then they show how he channels every ounce of that suffering into becoming the most terrifyingly intelligent, ruthless man in the room. They eventually give him this specialized chariot so he can ride into battle, and the sheer menace he projects without ever swinging his sword is incredible. It perfectly dramatizes why men would follow him.
Well, speaking of the men who followed him, to truly understand Ivar's success, we have to examine the instrument he wielded. Because a mastermind is nothing without a capable executive branch.
Right.
This great heathen army was not a solo act. It was, at its core, a coalition. And the foundation of that coalition was a very heavily armed family enterprise.
Okay, let's look at the board of directors for this invasion. If Ivar is the CEO, who are the other executives?
The sources name several key leaders, all reputed to be the sons of Ragnar Lothbrok. At the top, you have Ivar, universally regarded as the strategic core. Then you have Halfdan.
Halfdan.
Yeah, Halfdan is a massive figure in his own right, a very historical, well-documented leader who would go on to campaign extensively on his own later. He represents the formidable martial capability of the army.
So if Ivar is the brains, Halfdan is the muscle.
A simplification, but functionally accurate. Then there is Ubba, another brother heavily associated with the army's movements, particularly the later campaigns in East Anglia. And woven into the fringes of this legend and the broader historical record are the other brothers, Bjorn Ironside and Sigurd Snake in the Eye.
So it's less like a standard medieval army of conscripts and more like a modern corporate merger.
Exactly.
You have these incredibly powerful independent warlords They each have their own massive following of veteran warriors, their own fleets of ships, their own wealth. Normally, these guys would be competing with each other for resources in Scandinavia.
Yeah.
What on earth possessed them to pool their capital, form a monopoly, and launch a hostile takeover of England?
To answer that, we have to look at the motive. And the sagas give us one of the most famous, gruesome, and cinematic motives in all of Norse literature. Blood vengeance,
Ah.
the legend of the snake pit.
Oh, this is such a dark story. If you're listening and aren't familiar with the legend, it goes like this. Their father, Ragnar Lothbrok, is campaigning in England. He is defeated and captured by King Ella of Northumbria.
Right.
Ella decides to execute Ragnar, but he wants to do it in a way that humiliates this great pagan warlord. So he has Ragnar thrown into a deep pit filled with venomous snakes.
Such a specific way to go.
It's terrifying. And as Ragnar is dying in the dark, being bitten dozens of times, he refuses to scream. Instead, he laughs. And he delivers this chilling prophecy to his executioners, how the little pigs would grunt if they knew how the old boar suffered.
A legendary line.
Meaning, my sons are going to find out what you did to me, and they're going to absolutely destroy you.
It is a phenomenal piece of dramatic storytelling. According to the sagas, the sons receive the news of their father's horrific death. They are overcome with grief and a cold, calculating rage. They vow to avenge him. They use their vast networks to assemble this unprecedented multinational army. They cross the North Sea and they land in England with a singular, burning purpose to make King Ella pay.
It is the ultimate revenge movie plot. But I hear the historian in you warming up.
You know me too well.
Let me play skeptic for a second. We're calling Ivar this unmatched mastermind, but was this really about avenging his dad? Or is that just the medieval equivalent of an action movie tagline?
You are right to be skeptical. We have to apply a very critical lens to the snake pit story. While the vengeance narrative provides an incredible, emotionally resonant framing device, the real historical motives were almost certainly far more pragmatic and structural.
Pragmatic meaning economics?
Economics, demographics, and political opportunism. The Scandinavian population was growing steadily during this period. The arable agricultural land back home, nestled between mountains and fjords, was strictly limited.
Right, they were running out of space.
Exactly. You had an entire generation of younger sons who were not going to inherit land. And right across the North Sea sat England, a fractured, immensely wealthy land with temperate weather and fantastic soil, which was practically begging to be conquered.
So the snake pit story might be a complete fabrication.
Many historians believe the vengeance motive was a layer of legendary justification added by later saga writers to explain why such a massive, unprecedented invasion happened in 865.
That makes sense.
I mean, it is much more poetic and honorable to say, we crossed the sea to avenge our murdered father, than to say, we realized your tax base was highly vulnerable, your military was uncoordinated, and we wanted your farmland.
Okay, but let's unpack this mechanism. Even if the vengeance narrative was a complete fabrication, even if it was just a brilliant PR story they told around the campfires, we have to admit it functioned flawlessly.
Absolutely.
If you are Ivar, and you want to convince thousands of independent, stubborn, ambitious Viking warriors to follow you across the freezing sea and fight a prolonged, multi-year war, let's avenge the greatest hero of our people, is a much better pitch than let's go secure some fertile real estate in East Anglia.
That is an excellent point regarding the utility of myth. Whether it was the literal truth or a brilliantly deployed piece of propaganda, the vengeance narrative provided the ideological glue that held this massive, volatile coalition together.
It gave them a mission.
It gave them a shared sacred cause. It united disparate factions under a single banner.
So they have the motive real or manufactured, they have the men, they have the ships. But how do they actually operate on the ground? Because earlier we said this army was a paradigm shift. How do you transition from raiding coastal monasteries to systematically dismantling entire kingdoms?
To understand the mechanism of their conquest, we have to look at the geopolitical chessboard they were stepping onto. England in 865 was not the unified country we recognize today. It was deeply fractured into what was left of the Anglo-Saxon heptarchy, 4 major competing kingdoms.
Let's lay out the map for the listener. Who are the players?
In the north, you had Northumbria. In the vast Midlands stretching across the center of the country was Mercia. In the east, facing the sea, was East Anglia. And down in the south and west was Wessex.
Got it.
And it is vital to understand that these kingdoms did not view themselves as a single English brotherhood. They were frequently bitter rivals.
They weren't teaming up.
No, they constantly bickered over borders, they engaged in trade wars, and they sometimes went to active war with one another. They were fiercely, stubbornly independent.
And Ivar, the master strategist, takes one look at that map and sees the structural weakness.
He weaponized their disunity with terrifying efficiency. If England had been a single united nation under one supreme king, they might have been able to muster a massive national army and throw the Vikings back into the sea through sheer numbers. But because they were divided, Ivar could play them against each other.
He could fight one kingdom while the other three just sat back behind their borders watching and thinking, well, it's a shame about East Anglia, but at least it's not us. Let's not get involved.
Exactly. The Great Army didn't just smash and grab. They played a long, calculating game of geopolitical isolation. And Ivar's opening move in 865 perfectly demonstrates this strategic patience.
Let's talk about that opening move. They land in East Anglia. What happens?
The immense fleet arrives on the shores of East Anglia. The East Anglians are terrified by the sheer scale of the force. But rather than fighting a pitched battle they know they will lose, the East Anglian leadership decides to negotiate. They offer the Vikings a truce. They will let the Vikings spend the winter there in peace. But the price of that peace is fascinating. The East Anglians supply the Viking army with horses. They essentially pay them to go bother someone else.
Wait, explain that to me. They gave an invading army horses. That sounds like throwing gasoline on a fire. Why would the East Anglians think giving their enemy a massive tactical upgrade was a good idea?
Because the East Anglians were thinking locally, while Ivar was thinking continentally. The East Anglians just wanted the Vikings out of their immediate territory. They figured if they gave them horses, the Vikings would ride off into Mercia or Northumbria, and East Anglia would be spared. It was short-term survival thinking.
But by doing that, they handed Ivar the one piece of the puzzle he was missing.
Precisely. They solved the Vikings' major weakness on land speed. Now, we need to clarify something. These were not cavalry in the medieval sense. The Vikings did not generally fight on horseback. They didn't do massive cavalry charges with lances.
So how did they use the horses?
They used them as mounted infantry. The horses allowed the army to move swiftly across the Roman roads of England, covering vast distances in a single day.
Oh.
They could strike deep inland, capture a town, and fortify it before the local Anglo-Saxon militias, who were mostly traveling on foot, could even gather their forces to respond.
They turned a slow-moving, sea-dependent infantry into a highly mobile strike force. That is brilliant. So they have mobility. But you also mentioned they stayed the winter.
Yes, the winter camps.
Let's expand on that, because I feel like this is where the reality really diverges from the Hollywood image of just a bunch of guys shivering under overturned boats on a beach. How did an army of thousands survive an English winter?
This is where we see the sophisticated logistics of the Great Heathen Army. They didn't just roam around aimlessly, foraging for scraps. They thought in terms of seasons, years, and decades. When winter approached, they established massive, highly organized winter camps, known in the chronicles as Gework.
Paint a picture of these camps for me. Because feeding and housing thousands of people in the 9th century without modern supply lines sounds impossible.
These camps were practically mobile cities. They were almost always situated strategically beside major rivers. This allowed their longships to reach them, providing a constant lifeline for supplies, communication, and a quick escape route if necessary.
So they used the rivers as their highway system.
Yes. Upon choosing a site, the army would immediately engage in massive earth-moving projects. They would dig deep defensive ditches and raise extensive earthen ramparts, often topped with wooden palisades. Inside these walls, the whole force would hunker down for the cold months.
Right.
But they weren't just sitting idle around campfires. These camps were hubs of intense industry.
What are they doing all winter?
They are repairing weapons, forging new armor, weaving cloth, negotiating treaties with local leaders, gathering intelligence on their next target, and ruthlessly extorting food from the surrounding countryside to sustain their numbers. And crucially, it wasn't just warriors in these camps.
Right, the sources say they were families.
Yes, and archaeological excavations have confirmed this. These camps contained craftspeople, metal workers, traders, and importantly, women and children.
Wow.
This wasn't just an expeditionary strike force of single men. This was a migrating society. They brought their entire world with them. They settled in, survived the winter through organized resource management, and emerged in the spring fully supplied and ready to continue the conquest.
I love when history leaves us actual receipts. I mean, this isn't just paper history written by terrified monks. We actually have physical proof of this, right? The ground itself remembers this army.
It does. And this is where the history becomes intensely visceral. Let's look at the specific archaeological site at the village of Repton in Derbyshire.
Repton, this is in the old Kingdom of Mercia, right in the center of England.
Correct. The Anglo-Saxon chronicles explicitly state that the Great Heathen Army moved into Mercia and established their winter camp at Repton in the years 873 to 874. It was a highly strategic location on the River Trent, allowing them to dominate the Midlands.
So, centuries later, archaeologists go to this quiet English village, they start digging, and what exactly do they find?
They found the undeniable physical footprint of Ivar's war machine. They uncovered a massive D-shaped earthwork fortification right on the banks of the river.
Explain the D shape. Why build it like that?
The flat side of the D is formed by the river bank itself. This protects the fleet of ships moored in the water. The curved part of the D is the massive ditch and rampart facing the land, protecting the camp from Anglo-Saxon counterattacks.
That's smart.
It's a textbook Viking defensive structure maximizing natural barriers. But what's truly astonishing about Repton is that they built this fortification so that it directly incorporated an existing Anglo-Saxon stone church into its walls.
Wait, they used a church as part of their wall?
They literally used the stone church of St. Weston as a gatehouse or a defensive strongpoint.
That is such a psychological flex. You don't just build a camp in their territory. You take their sacred ancestral stone church, a place where Mercian kings were buried, and you turn it into the guard shack for your pagan invasion force.
It is a profound statement of dominance and desecration. But the most chilling discovery at Repton wasn't the defensive walls. Just outside the church, archaeologists found something grim. A mass grave.
If you're listening to this, try to visualize this. Imagine walking into the quiet graveyard of your local parish church and discovering that the ground beneath is essentially a 9th century war crime scene. Set the scene for this grave. What exactly did they find in the dirt?
They found the remains of at least 264 people, carefully but densely buried together in a massive mound. The vast majority of these skeletons were robust adult men, and when osteologists, bone specialists examined the remains, they found extensive evidence of violent traumatic injuries.
How do they know these were battle injuries and not just bones getting crushed by soil over 1,000 years?
That's where the science is fascinating. Osteologists look for perimortem trauma injuries that occurred at or near the time of death. Bone that is fresh and living breaks and cuts differently than dry, dead bone. They found deep, sharp force trauma to the skulls consistent with heavy sword or axe strikes. They found severed limbs. They found perifractures on the forearms, the unmistakable defensive wounds of men raising their arms to block a lethal blow in close quarters combat.
And these bodies weren't just tossed in randomly, were they? They were arranged around a focal point.
Yes. The mass of bodies was arranged around a central, high-status burial of a particularly robust man who had also died violently. He was buried with a sword, a silver Thor's hammer pendant, and a boar's tusk.
So a leader.
It strongly suggests a war leader who fell in battle, surrounded in death by the warriors who fought alongside him.
But how do we know these were Vikings? Couldn't this just be a mass grave of the local Mercian defenders who died trying to fight them off?
That was a major question, and the answer came from isotopic analysis of the teeth and bones.
Okay, I need you to explain how a tooth tells you where a medieval warrior was born. What is the mechanism there?
It's essentially a geographic barcode locked in the body. As your adult teeth form during childhood, the enamel absorbs trace elements from your diet, specifically from the local groundwater and the soil the crops were grown in. One of these elements is strontium.
Strontium.
Right. Different geographical regions have unique ratios of strontium isotopes in their bedrock. Once your tooth enamel is fully formed, that ratio is locked in forever.
So if you grow up drinking water from a Norwegian fjord, your teeth have a different chemical signature than someone who grew up drinking water in the English Midlands.
Precisely. And when scientists analyzed the teeth from the Repton mass grave, the isotopic signatures showed that a significant portion of these men were not local to England. Their signatures matched various regions across Scandinavia and the wider Viking world.
I want to just slow down and let this breathe for a second. We spend so much time in history podcasts talking about legends, about sagas written hundreds of years later, about myths of snake pits and giant heroes. But right there, in the dirt of Derbyshire, are the actual tangible bones of the Great Heathen Army.
It grounds the myth in undeniable physical reality.
These are the men who rode the ships. These are the men who demanded the horses from East Anglia. These are the very men who followed Ivar the Boneless. You can physically hold the skull of a man, and trace the groove where an Anglo-Saxon sword ended his life. It bridges the gap between a story in a book and the violent, terrifying reality of the 9th century.
It does. And while the presence at Repton was in 873, toward the later stages of the campaign, we need to rewind slightly to look at the massive strategic movements that brought them to that point. Because from their starting point in East Anglia in 865, where they got their horses, we have to follow them north to the most infamous chapter of their conquest.
Right. They winter in East Anglia, they get their horses, and in 866, the army turns north. They ride along the old Roman roads, heading straight for Northumbria, King Ella's kingdom, the target of the legendary vengeance.
And once again, Ivar's strategic genius shines. He doesn't just launch a blind frontal assault against a fortified kingdom, he utilizes intelligence and timing. He waits for the perfect moment of structural weakness. Northumbria, at that very moment, was tearing itself apart in a bitter civil war.
Wow, perfect timing.
Two rival kings, Osbert and Ella, were fighting each other for control of the throne.
So the English are too busy killing each other to look at the horizon and see the Viking army approaching.
Exactly. Ivar strikes while they are entirely distracted. The great Heathen Army sweeps in and easily captures the great northern city of York, or Jorvik, as the Vikings called it, taking advantage of the chaotic political vacuum.
York is a massive prize. It eventually becomes a Viking stronghold and a bustling trade hub for over a century, but we'll definitely save the culture of Viking York for another deep dive.
We will. So the Vikings hold York behind strong Roman walls. Finally, the two rival Northumbrian kings realize the existential threat they're facing. They realize their civil war means nothing if the kingdom falls. They agree to stop fighting each other, they hastily combine their battered forces, and they march on York to take it back.
But it's too little, too late.
Far too late. The unified Northumbrian army assaults the walls, they break into the city, but it's a trap. They are completely crushed by the Viking forces in the narrow streets. Both of the rival kings are killed in the battle, and one of those kings, fighting in the mud and blood of York, is Ella.
King Ella, the man who supposedly threw Ragnar into the snake pit.
He falls alive into the hands of Ragnar's sons.
And this brings us to what might be the single most debated, gruesome, and controversial topic in all of Viking history, the Blood Eagle.
It is a very dark subject, but it is entirely unavoidable if we are discussing Ivar and the climax of this vengeance campaign.
Okay, I am going to carefully but vividly describe what the sagas claim happened to King Ella. Because if we gloss over this, the listener won't understand exactly what kind of psychological terror we are talking about. According to the legend, the sons of Ragnar did not just execute Ella. Simply chopping off his head was far too quick, too honorable. They subjected him to a highly ritualized sacrificial torture known as the Blood Eagle.
A ritual supposedly dedicated as an offering to Odin.
Right. The procedure goes like this. The victim is forced face down onto the ground. The executioner takes a blade and slices the skin of the back open, exposing the ribcage. Then, and this is the truly horrific mechanical part, they take an axe or a specialized tool and literally sever the ribs from the spine, one by one.
It's gruesome.
Once the ribs are detached, they are physically bent outwards, splayed open to resemble the wings of an eagle spreading from the victim's back.
The physical trauma required to break ribs away from the thoracic spine is immense.
But it gets worse. With the back entirely open and the ribs splayed, the executioner reaches into the chest cavity and pulls the victim's lungs out through the wounds, draping them over the splayed ribs. The horrific, poetic cruelty of the ritual is that, for the few moments the victim is still alive and gasping for air, the lungs inflate and deflate on the outside of the body, making it look like the wings of a bloody eagle are fluttering.
It is quite possibly the most horrifying method of execution ever conceived by human minds. It transforms the victim's own body into a grotesque, living monument to the conqueror's vengeance.
Okay, but here's the million-dollar question for you. I know the sagas say this happened, but did they actually do this? Did Ivar the Boneless actually sit there and watch King Ella's back get carved open like a bird?
This is genuinely one of the most fiercely contested debates in all of Viking studies, and we need to look at both sides of the argument very carefully because the historical evidence is incredibly murky.
Let's start with the skeptics. What's the argument against it? Why wouldn't it be real?
For a long time, the dominant view among serious academic historians was that the Blood Eagle was entirely a myth. They argued it was either a morbid literary invention created by later Christian writers to make the pagans look as demonic and sadistic as possible, or it was a massive, tragic misunderstanding of Old Norse poetry.
Wait, a misunderstanding of poetry. I can understand exaggerating a battle, but how do you misunderstand a poem and accidentally invent the concept of ripping someone's lungs out through their back?
To understand how that could happen, you have to understand the nature of skaldic poetry. Norse skalds didn't write straightforward literal descriptions. They used highly complex metaphorical riddles called kennings.
Okay.
The argument goes like this. The original contemporary poems written shortly after these battles didn't describe a torture ritual at all. They used standard poetic imagery for a warrior dying on the battlefield and being left for the scavengers.
Like saying, he became food for the ravens.
Exactly. The poems might have contained a line like the eagle clawed at Ella's back. In the context of 9th century warrior poetry, that simply means Ella died in the battle, his corpse was left face down in the mud, and carrion birds scavenged his body. The eagle tearing at the back of the slain is a very, very common motif.
Oh, I see the mechanism now. So a skald writes, the eagle scratched his back, meaning he's just dead on the field. And then 250 years later, some Icelandic saga writer in a warm scriptorium reads that line, takes it completely literally and thinks, whoa, they carved an eagle into his back. How would you even do that? And they reverse engineered this horrific torture ritual to explain a poem.
That is exactly the theory, that over centuries of oral tradition and eventual translation, a poetic metaphor about scavenging birds mutated into a literal, physical ritual of torture.
That makes a massive amount of sense. It's like the ultimate game of historical telephone going horribly, horribly wrong. But I hear a but coming.
But the debate isn't settled. Because in recent years, some scholars and medical professionals have pushed back against the "it's just a misunderstood poem" theory. They decided to look at it not as a literary puzzle, but as an anatomical one.
Really?
Yes, they conducted a detailed medical study to answer a very dark question. Is the blood eagle even physically possible to perform on a human body using 9th century tools?
And what did the medical literature say?
The study concluded that, yes, anatomically speaking, a skilled individual with Viking-age weapons, like a specific type of hooked blade or a sharp axe, could physically perform the procedure as described in the sagas. The ribs could be severed from the spine and the lungs could be manipulated outward.
Good boy.
However, and this is a highly significant caveat, the medical consensus is that the victim would die extremely rapidly. The acute blood loss, the massive systemic shock, and the immediate pneumothorax, which is the collapsing of the lungs as soon as the chest cavity is breached, would kill the victim long before the ritual could be completed. They would absolutely not be alive to experience the final theatrical fluttering of the lungs.
So they would be dead halfway through the rib-cutting phase.
Almost certainly. But the fact that it is anatomically possible has led some scholars to argue that we shouldn't dismiss it entirely as myth. We know that ritual violence, theatrical cruelty, and human sacrifice dedicated to the gods were absolutely part of the Norse cultural landscape. It is entirely possible that the blood eagle was a real, albeit extremely rare, practice. It might have been reserved only for the most hated enemies, as an ultimate, terrifying offering to Odin.
So we have the misunderstood poem camp and the rare but real sacrificial ritual camp. Where does that leave us today?
It leaves us in a state of honest, uncomfortable uncertainty. The absolute truth of what happened to King Ella is probably lost to time. But here is the critical takeaway, whether it physically happened or not. The fact that the Norse told this story, the fact that they imagined this specific, elaborate horror as the ultimate fitting vengeance for the death of their hero, tells us something profound about their worldview. It tells us what they valued, what they feared, and how they conceptualized ultimate victory and retribution.
You know, it's fascinating how modern media interprets this ambiguity. The TV show Vikings treats it very much as the real and sacred ritual side of the debate.
Yes, the show's depiction of the blood eagle is quite famous, or perhaps infamous.
It is unforgettable and harrowing. You almost have to look away from the screen. But what's really interesting is how they frame the scene. They don't just show it as a bunch of sadists torturing a guy for fun. They frame the blood eagle as a deeply religious act, almost a dark sacrament.
Right.
And they introduce this theological rule. If the victim can endure the entire horrific process in absolute silence without crying out in pain, they will earn a place in Valhalla despite being a Christian enemy.
It adds a layer of spiritual gravity to the cruelty. It reflects the deeply ingrained Norse idea that suffering can be transcended by honor, and that how a man faces his inevitable death is the ultimate measure of his worth.
Exactly. It makes the victim an active participant in the ritual rather than just a piece of meat on a slab. It perfectly captures that Norse obsession with fatalism and courage. But as viewers, we just have to remember that the show is portraying the vivid, dramatic legend, while the actual history is buried in shadows and debated poetry.
Precisely. Now, returning to the historical campaign, because Ivar wasn't finished, with Northumbria broken and Ella dead, the great heathen army didn't pack up their ships and sail back to Scandinavia. They had tasted blood, they had secured a massive stronghold in York, and they saw exactly how vulnerable the rest of the island was. Under Ivar's direction, they methodically began dismantling the remaining Anglo-Saxon kingdoms.
So Northumbria's off the board. Where do they go next?
They turned their sights southward, they moved against Mercia again, they marched deep into the Midlands and occupied key royal sites, essentially holding a knife to the kingdom's throat. They forced the Mercian king to buy peace with massive amounts of silver, and eventually forced him to accept puppet rulers who answered to the Vikings.
A puppet state.
Mercia, the once great power of central England, is effectively neutralized without a massive pitched battle.
So that's 2 kingdoms down. Northumbria is dead. Mercia is a puppet state paying protection money. Who is next on Ivar's list?
They loop back to where the invasion began, East Anglia.
The people who gave them the horses, the people who thought they bought peace.
The very same. But this time, it's the year 869. The Vikings have spent 4 years conquering, they are battle-hardened, and they aren't asking for horses anymore. They are coming for the crown. They attack East Anglia outright, and this campaign gives us one of the most famous and culturally significant victims of the entire Viking Age, King Edmund of East Anglia.
This is a story that resonated for centuries in England. What happens to Edmund?
The Viking army, heavily led by Ivar and his brother Ubba in this theater, completely defeats the East Anglian forces. King Edmund is captured alive. Now, the traditional accounts, mostly the lives of the saints written by monks, tell us that the Vikings offered Edmund a deal. Yeah, he could remain alive and serve as a puppet king, ruling under their authority, if he would renounce his Christian faith and submit to the pagan gods.
And Edmund, being a devout Christian king, says no.
He refuses, absolutely. He refuses to share his earthly power with heathens, and he refuses to betray his God. Because of his defiance, the Vikings execute him in a manner that seems specifically designed to mock his faith and his kingship. According to the tradition, they bind him to a tree, they use him for target practice, shooting him so full of arrows that he resembles a hedgehog, and then they finally behead him and toss his head into the briars.
Just a brutal, undignified end. But by doing that, they kind of created their own worst nightmare, didn't they, from a long-term psychological and PR perspective?
In the long run, yes, it was a profound miscalculation. By torturing and martyring him, they transformed a defeated, relatively minor king into a massive, unifying religious symbol. King Edmund doesn't just die, he becomes Saint Edmund the Martyr.
Saint Edmund, I remember reading that he was essentially the patron saint of England long before St. George came along.
Exactly. His shrine at Bury St. Edmunds became one of the most important, wealthiest, and most heavily visited pilgrimage sites in medieval England. His death became the ultimate, shining symbol of Christian resistance against the pagan onslaught.
And I want to dig into that psychological aspect because it connects to how the people actually living through this experienced the Great Heathen Army. We sit here looking at a map, moving pieces around. We say, oh, Ivar conquered East Anglia to secure a political tax base in agricultural land. But to the Anglo-Saxons on the ground, this wasn't just a political regime change. This wasn't just a new king collecting taxes. This was an apocalypse.
It was an existential threat to their entire reality, both physical and spiritual.
Right. The Vikings weren't just a different nationality fighting over a border. They were heathens. They worshipped Odin and Thor. They were descending on a Christian land and explicitly targeting the things the English held most sacred.
The monasteries, the centers of learning, wealth, and faith.
The monasteries. They were burning the churches to the ground, slaughtering the monks who couldn't fight back, and stealing the holy relics to melt down the gold. To the monks who were hurriedly writing the chronicles by candlelight, Ivar the Boneless wasn't a brilliant tactician. He was a literal agent of Satan, sent by God to punish the English for their sins.
That's how they saw it.
The martyrdom of King Edmund perfectly crystallizes this mindset. This wasn't a war over territory. To the Anglo-Saxons, it was a cosmic battle between the faithful and the forces of darkness.
That religious dimension is absolutely crucial to understanding the era. The sense of being a besieged, holy remnant would deeply shape the English psyche. It fueled a desperate ideological resistance that eventually though not during Ivar's direct command, stopped the Vikings from taking the entire island.
Because at this exact moment at 870, we are looking at total catastrophic collapse. Ivar has broken Northumbria, he's completely broken East Anglia, he's subjugated Mercia. That's three of the four ancient Anglo-Saxon kingdoms essentially wiped off the map or entirely controlled by the Great Army.
Only one major kingdom remains independent, Wessex in the Deep South.
Wessex, where a certain young, bookish prince named Alfred is watching all of this happen, realizing he is the last man standing between the Vikings and the total eradication of Anglo-Saxon England.
Yes. The defense of Wessex would ultimately fall to Alfred, the man who would eventually earn the title Alfred the Great. But his epic, desperate struggle against the Great Army in the swamps of Somerset is a massive story that deserves its own dedicated deep dive.
Definitely.
Because right at this exact moment of absolute triumph, right when the Vikings control almost the entire country and Wessex is on the brink, Ivar pulls a vanishing act.
This has to be one of the most baffling historical puzzles of the whole era. He's the undisputed mastermind. He's conquered three kingdoms. He's at the absolute height of his power and wealth. And then, poof, he just disappears from the English chronicles.
Yeah.
The Anglo-Saxon records simply stop mentioning Ivar the Boneless.
It is a sudden and deafening silence in the historical record. Where did the Supreme Commander go? Why abandon the campaign right before the final victory?
Did he die of his disability? Did he retire to a farm in York?
The most compelling answer, and the one accepted by a very large number of modern historians, is that he didn't die or retire. He relocated. He looked at the map, realized the English interior was bogged down in grueling counterinsurgency warfare, and he looked west across the Irish Sea.
Ireland.
Yes. At the exact same time, Ivar mysteriously vanishes from the English records, a wildly powerful Viking warlord suddenly emerges in the Irish annals. His name is Ivar.
Ivar and Imar. Okay, the linguistics there aren't exactly a huge leap.
No, they are direct linguistic cognates. And the circumstantial evidence tying these two figures together into one man is incredibly strong. Ivar suddenly appears as a dominant veteran force, deeply involved in the Norse kingdom centered around Dublin.
Let's talk about Dublin, because we briefly touched on this in previous episode, how Dublin didn't start as an Irish city, but as a massive Viking trading hub.
Exactly. Dublin, or Dyflin as the Norse called it, was the jewel of the Western Viking world. It was obscenely wealthy. It was a nexus of maritime trade routes connecting Scandinavia, the British Isles, Francia, and even trade networks stretching down to the Mediterranean and the Middle East. It was also one of the largest slave markets in Western Europe.
So if Ivar and Imar are the same person, which seems highly probable, it means he didn't vanish into obscurity. He executed a massive strategic pivot. Having broken the back of England and secured the land, he left the muddy, expensive mock-up operations to his brothers like Halfdan, and he personally moved to take control of the most lucrative economic center in the entire region.
He went from being a conquering field general to the CEO of a multinational trading empire. He shifted his headquarters to dominate the maritime economy of the entire Irish Sea.
It demonstrates, once again, a mind that thought on a macro level. He recognized where the true liquid wealth and long-term power lay. It wasn't in fighting Alfred in a swamp, it was in controlling the trade routes. And the Irish annals, which historians generally consider very reliable and much less mythologized than the later Norse sagas, give us the end of his story.
They do. The Irish monks record his death around the year 873. And the title they use to describe him in his obituary is breathtaking. They don't call him a raider or a chieftain. They call him the King of the Norsemen of all Ireland and Britain.
King of the Norsemen of all Ireland and Britain. That is not a title you give to a guy who just ran a few raiding ships. That is a title you give to an emperor.
It reflects a man of unfathomable power and geographic reach. He had effectively created a maritime empire spanning from the coasts of Ireland across the sea, tying together the conquered lands of York and East Anglia.
And there's a wild, ironic footnote to this whole Imar connection in Dublin, isn't there? Especially considering the theories we discussed about his nickname early on.
Yes. You recall the theory that the Boneless was a crude joke about impotence, the rumor that he was physically incapable of fathering an heir.
Yeah, that he was a brilliant general but left no legacy.
Well, if Ivar is indeed Imar of Dublin, that theory goes entirely out the window, because Imar of Dublin became the patriarch of one of the most powerful, prolific, and enduring dynasties in Viking history.
The Uí Ímair.
The Uí Ímair, translated literally the descendants of Ivar. This family, his direct bloodline, would go on to dominate the Irish Sea world for over a century. They provided kings of Dublin, kings of York, warlords who shaped the politics of the British Isles long after Ivar was in his grave.
So the man who supposedly couldn't walk, the man some sources claim couldn't even have kids, ends up founding a royal bloodline that ruled two countries for 100 years. That is the ultimate revenge against everyone who ever mocked him.
The boneless man cast the longest shadow of them all.
So what does this all mean? As we start to synthesize everything we've talked about, the winter camps, the mass graves, the destroyed kingdoms, the Irish Empire, how should we look back at Ivar? Because he forces us to rethink everything we thought we knew about this period.
He absolutely does. Ivar is a mirror that challenges our historical assumptions. We instinctively imagine the Viking Age as a time when the biggest, loudest, most physically imposing warrior ruled the roost. We picture the giant with the battle axe standing on the prow of a ship.
Right.
And yet the evidence strongly suggests that the most successful, the most feared, and the most consequential leader of that entire generation was a man who may have had a severe physical disability.
A man who had to be carried on a shield.
Yes, his power did not reside in his biceps, it resided in his mind. It was his strategic genius, his logistical planning, his psychological cunning, and his absolute unbending will that conquered kingdoms. Ivar is the historical proof that even in the most brutally martial culture imaginable, intellect could ultimately trump muscle.
You know, it's almost like his disability was his greatest advantage. If he'd been born with strong legs, if he could have run and fought normally like Halfdan or Bjorn, maybe he just becomes another guy in the shield wall. Maybe he dies anonymously from a random spear thrust at age 20, and history never remembers his name.
That is a fascinating counterfactual. The disability forced the brilliance.
Because he was physically limited, he was forced, from the time he was a child, to rely entirely on his wits. He had to be smarter than everyone else just to survive. He min-maxed his brain because his physical stats were so low. He developed a ruthlessness and a strategic vision that none of his physically perfect brothers could match.
It is the ultimate triumph of compensation, and we have to look at his legacy because it is impossible to overstate. Ivar marks the fulcrum of the Viking Age in the West. Before Ivar and the great Heathen Army, the Vikings were a nuisance. They were violent, terrifying raiders, but they were temporary.
They were the passing storm.
Exactly. After Ivar, they were conquerors. They were colonizers. He transformed the Norse presence in Britain from seasonal plundering into permanent settlement. The territory that he and his brothers carved out through blood and strategy would eventually become known as the Danelaw.
Let's expand on the Danelaw for a second, because it wasn't just a line on a map. It changed the DNA of England.
It was a massive geopolitical shift. The Danelaw was the vast swath of northern and eastern England that operated under Norse law, Norse customs, and heavy Norse settlement. Ivar didn't just win a few battles and take some gold. He literally changed the map of England. He changed the language.
Right, you can still see it today.
Yeah.
Every town in England that ends in by or thorpe.
Exactly. Grimsby, Scunthorpe, Derby, those are Norse place names, meaning a farm or a village. He changed the legal structures, introducing concepts like the 12-man jury. He permanently altered the genetic makeup of the island through intermarriage. He initiated the transformation of England itself from an Anglo-Saxon stronghold into an Anglo-Scandinavian hybrid.
But, and I think this is crucial as we wrap up, we can't fall into the trap of romanticizing him just because he was brilliant or because he overcame a disability.
No, we absolutely must not. Ivar embodies the darkest, most terrifying face of the Viking expansion.
We're talking about the Blood Eagle, whether it was real or a terrifying psychological legend they cultivated. We're talking about the cold, calculating ruthlessness, the massacre of monks, the martyrdom of kings, the mass enslavement of populations that fueled the immense wealth of Dublin.
He was not a modern hero. He was a conqueror in the brutal reality of the 9th century. He brought unimaginable destruction, trauma, and death to tens of thousands of people. His legend is entirely drenched in blood.
And yet, acknowledging all of that horror, you still have to stand back and look at what he achieved with a kind of dark awe. He was a disabled man who conquered through sheer force of mind. He built a multinational coalition, dismantled 3 ancient kingdoms, founded a century-long dynasty, and burned his name so deeply into the bedrock of history that here we are, 1,100 years later, still trying to figure him out.
He is undeniably one of the most remarkable and complex figures of the medieval world.
Before we go, I want to leave you with a final thought to chew on. Something that builds on everything we've just discussed. Think about how fragile history is. Think about how much of the world as we know it is shaped by the people society, is quickest to write off. We talked about how the Norse would sometimes expose weak infants to the freezing elements. If Ragnar Lothbrok had been a lesser man, or just a little more traditional, the infant Ivar might have been left on a hillside to die. If Ivar had been born with strong legs, he might have died a forgotten foot soldier. Did a random, tragic twist of genetics, a mutation that made a boy's bones brittle, inadvertently cause the fall of Anglo-Saxon England? Did the failure of one man's legs set in motion the creation of a dynasty, the burning of the monasteries, and the permanent redrawing of the map of Europe? It makes you wonder how many empires have fallen or been built because of someone the rest of the world thought was broken.
That is a genuinely haunting perspective. The hinge of history turning on a genetic anomaly.
Well, we have conquered the freezing north, we've waded through the mud and the blood of the Danelaw, and we've survived the mind of Ivar. Next time, we are going to pivot entirely. We're following another of Ragnar's sons on an adventure that is so wild it feels like a movie script.
A very different kind of campaign.
We are sailing south. Next time on the Deep Dive, we follow Bjorn Ironside on an audacious years-long expedition deep into the warm blue waters of the Mediterranean. We're talking about strikes on Spain, North Africa, Italy, and one of the greatest, most legendary deceptions in all of Viking history, involving a city he mistakenly thought was Rome itself.
From the freezing winter camps of Repton to the sun-drenched coasts of Italy, the sons of Ragnar truly reshaped the known world.
It's going to be an incredible ride. Until then, thank you for coming along on this journey into the mind of the boneless.